Just as people are filtering in through the Zoom mechanism, through the Zoom world, I'd like to welcome you all to the Economy and Society virtual summer school. Today we're hearing from Professor Ilana Gershon, and I suppose we'll be getting her thoughts on neoliberalism, job seeking. Her most recent book is Down and Out in the New Labour Market, how people do and don't find jobs in the new world of work. And so I read this and found it interesting, having been searching for a job somewhat at that time myself. So it's, I suppose over to Ilana, and we'll have maybe about I don't know, 7, 8, 9, 10 minutes, whatever you're comfortable with. And if you tell us about your new work, your old work, your current interests, and we'll move from that into a general discussion. And of course, as usual, we are being recorded. So if you're not comfortable with being recorded, this is not the place for you. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Ilana.
Thank you. I'm really pleased to be part of this very impressive lineup that you have concocted for us. The other talks also look just absolutely fantastic. I want to talk just for very briefly. I want to give you a little context for both of my papers. So first of all, when I was beginning to write my first article on neoliberalism, which I guess was in 2005, 2006, probably 70% of the papers and conference talks in anthropology had neoliberal in their title. So neoliberalism was constantly being mentioned in my intellectual world. And yet I was constantly confounded by what people actually meant by neoliberalism, because much of the time it sounded like good old-fashioned capitalism to me. And so I felt I had a choice, right? I could either develop a more elaborate and precise toolkit for determining for myself when a phenomenon really was neoliberalism by my standards, or when it was just good old-fashioned capitalism, or I could go off and I could study something much more fun, like cosplay. And I decided to figure out for myself what makes neoliberalism part of a distinct historical moment and just constantly long to do cosplay as the dream deferred. And I wanted to think about especially how to delineate neoliberalism as a very distinct stage of capitalism. And trying to uncover different strategies for doing this has been shaping most of my work for the past decade and a half. Okay, so my first attempt is the article Neoliberal Agency. And at the time, describing the neoliberal self as an entrepreneurial self was a fairly commonplace thing to do, but I wanted to go a little bit further than that. I wanted to know what are the principal assumptions underlying an entrepreneurial self so that I could distinguish it from a generic capitalist self. So what kind of agency does a neoliberal self exhibit? And what kind of relationships can a neoliberal self have? And the 67-second version of what I came up with that is in my articles is that a neoliberal self is a bundle of skills, assets, experiences, qualities, and relationships that has to be consciously managed and constantly enhanced. And that the self enters into relationships with other social unities structured as corporate personhood. And these are relationships in which the goal is to distribute risk and responsibility among all the participants in mutually beneficial ways when what counts as mutually beneficial is really up for grabs, and also through a form of contractual sociality. And it turns out that other anthropologists found this model of the neoliberal self fairly analytically productive. So for example, some scholars found it very useful to think more about scale fetishism, which is the ways in which neoliberal logics ignore differences in scale to such a degree that it can make sense for 4 women in Bangladesh to come together in a microcredit scheme with a bank and try to make sure that the bank does not bear too much risk by loaning them money. Now, before neoliberalism, any good capitalist would have considered this particular formulation truly bizarre. But here you see that contracts become a legal technology for overlooking the complexities of social unities in much the same way that commodity fetishism has encouraged us to overlook labor. But this model that I was writing was based on reading other people's ethnographies and theoretical analyses, not based on any ethnography of my own. And so I was left wondering, if my model is correct, What issues come up for people when they try to implement it? When do some people use some parts of the neoliberal logic to argue against others? What are the internal tensions for people living as neoliberals that might lead to change and transformation? I'm ever hopeful. So unlike Wendy Brown and Nicholas Rose and Will Davies and other critics of neoliberalism that you've probably all engaged with, I'm trying not to criticize from the outside, so to speak. I'm interested in the internal fissures, when people argue for skills as opposed to networks, for example. And so to do this, I decided I was going to study the hiring ritual. And in the name of research, I ended up suffering through more workshops on how to craft the most appealing genre repertoire for the job market, the most appealing resume, LinkedIn profile, or personal brand that anyone other than a researcher should ever attend, as well as interviewing over 150 people on all sides of the hiring, right? The hiring managers, recruiters, HR people, and job seekers. Now, I want to say two more things about my take on neoliberalism. At the beginning of employing the CEO of Me Incorporated, I suggested that I'm taking neoliberal logics to be oddly parallel to communism in the Soviet Union. It sounds cheeky, but I'm also actually fairly serious about this. Both approaches are based on abstract and transformative texts that provide trenchant critique of contemporaneous economic systems, but little insight into what should come next. Just as Marx offered his readers little insight into what social life might actually be under communism, this is also a failure for Hayek, the Austrian economist, and his other colleagues in the Mount Pelerin Society. In the cases of both Marxism and neoliberalism, people on the ground have had to tackle a quixotic task of translation. They've been turning a theoretical armature, packed with critique and bold overarching principles, but bereft of socially prescriptive insights, into a set of guidelines for the practical quandaries of daily life. Neither Marx nor Hayek, for example, explained how hiring should take place under communism or an ideal free market condition, respectively. But as I hope my article helped convince you, if life hasn't already, hiring is a commonplace but fairly significant activity. Hiring is foundationally a question of what kind of person a community of workers might want to join them. And even signaling possible answers to this question can help people address crucial dilemmas connecting moral philosophy, economic precepts, and everyday practices. So the last thing I want to talk about before opening this up to chatting with you is to ask, what questions did all this work leave me with? Now, my current research on Americans' experiences working in person during the pandemic started off trying to explore two large questions that were still nagging at me. First, if everyone is seriously committed to this idea that we are all entrepreneurial selves and that every business is a nest of tiny businesses contracting with a larger business for the moment as an employee, does neoliberalism make the age-old question of why would anyone accept a boss into a new and pressing question? Like, so what does it mean to govern and be governed at work if everyone is in a business-to-business relationship with each other? And then my last question that was really haunting me is that it hasn't escaped my attention that Trump doesn't sound very much like a neoliberal. He may act like a neoliberal at times, but he doesn't really sound like one. And I've been wondering if part of his appeal is that he rejects stable contracts and being stable within contracts, which, let's face it, is a necessary component of neoliberalism if it's going to function at all. But in that case, what contracts are actually making people so unhappy that they would vote for Trump? I got very interested in employment contracts and how contractual sociality functions in the workplace. And then the pandemic hit and changed my field work in ways that I'm really happy to talk to you guys about. But I just wrote a very short piece about how Trump appears to be neoliberal, which is going to be coming out very soon. And so I want to kind of give you a sneak peek of this in the chat. And so if you want to look at that afterwards, this is the rant that I have been bottling up for 4 years and finally found a place to put it because I was resisting doing the ethnography that would actually support the rant.
Okay, so thanks very much. Just to start us off with, more questions than an hour could possibly cope with, but can I just begin? The world in which people say neoliberalism about everything. The two figures that most caught my eye in your work that I'm very interested in was you have Foucault on neoliberalism and the birth of buyout politics, and also then Boltanski and Schiapello's New Spirit of Capitalism. And of course, I get the perspective whereby you're trying to make this conception of neoliberalism more specific or work out the contradictions in it. Could you say that? I mean, is it a flat rejection of Foucault and a somewhat feeling that maybe Boltanski has got something going on in the New Spirit, or can you in some way talk about how those works maybe informed the directions you're taking?
So, okay, so can I ask a question about your question?
Go on.
Do people generally think that these two thinkers are at odds with each other? That Foucault and Boltanski and Schiapello? Okay.
Not hugely, no. But.
No, I mean, I was like, yeah, they're both really useful to think about. So kind of, I mean, it really is what I was talking about in my article, which is that I think Foucault acted with great integrity in tracking who was coming up with these ideas, right? Normally when people talk about neoliberalism, at least in anthropology, they're not always turning to the particular thinkers from which this came from, right? And kind of tracking the historical trajectory that led to the particular changes that happened. And I think it's very important to think about why these ideas were emerging the way they were, who was thinking about them, and how they translate, and then how they translate and spread, right? And so Foucault deals with the beginning part of this in tracking the fact that there were different strands to this. There was the Chicago school, the Austrian school, that this was spreading out in a variety of ways, and that there was an internal logic that brought everybody to the same table, but that people disagreed with each other, right? So that kind of Foucault clears the path for saying there's a left neoliberal and a right neoliberal, which I think is a very useful distinction to have. And he clears the path for kind of thinking about the variety. And what I see Boltanski and Schiapello doing is the hard work of asking, how does it get implemented? Right, which Foucault would have done if he had lived longer. Possibly, right?
Yeah. So I mean, because the emphasis on projects in Boltanski and Schiapello seems broadly. I'm sorry, I'm sort of taking chair for a moment or two, just because I'm indulgent and self-indulgent, and I will ask people, please do put your hand up for questions in a moment. I'm just being self-indulgent at first, and I put up your hands or stick a question into the chat, and we'll get round to it. You know, we're here to have fun. And this thing in Boltanski, though, Boltanski and Schiapello, we must give them full credit. It is very much about getting involved in projects, and the projects are very contractual, and yet it always, I mean, this thing about the project always seemed to me something separate from the self in Boltanski and Schiapello. It's like you'd get involved in this project, whereas your sort of emphasis on the person as a bundle of skills or a business solution seems much more like, I don't know, a sort of combination with Foucault of the recreation of the self as the skill set, or something like that.
Okay, so to me, it's a slightly different kind of a slightly different question, right? So, and like you're saying the project, and I have to admit, I've just been thinking through this really fabulous article that is not yet published, but is coming, by Andy Gran, who's kind of taking Boltanski and Schiapello and saying, well, actually, the project form is a form that we have been kind of invested in engaging in too much, that there's other ways in which work is being organized, but that as kind of ethnographers and have focused a lot on the project form, which has its own collection of genres, its own repertoire for organizing itself, and its own kind of temporality and way of recruiting people to participate. And that kind of sense of boundedness is both kind of very important for understanding the contract, but also leaves open the question of what do you do when you are actually living a life that is itself not a project, but that you are a being contributing to a variety of projects. So life, to say life is not a project sounds inane and obvious, but part of what I'm asking is kind of, okay, if the world is being crafted in terms of this project form, and that's how we're experiencing labor, is that it is packaged for many people in project forms, though not everyone. Who are the people who then have to engage with that? And what are the costs for moving from project to project when you have other forms of work that have been historically present just a few decades ago? And I guess that's why I'm focusing on the person, right? I want to know what is the self that ends up getting swept into the project.
Yeah, I always think it's great when a theory actually gets as far as not describing the other or the other world of, another imaginary workspace, but our academic workspace. I mean, we are in a project right now. I mean, it's not there's no contracts involved, because I mean, if you didn't turn up today, we could only send you a complaint or something like that. What could we do, But everything is projects. I have
serious reputational costs writing on this.
Oh, I know. Really me too. It's important, But yeah, it's so recognizable that, I mean, that's what I thought about Poltanski's. It was so spot on, because it was like, well, yes, we live in these projects. I find myself doing projects. We're all projective persons, or else we wouldn't be here. Nobody's mandated this course for anything. So,
well, I mean, Tom, you're speaking to one of the things that I am deeply suspicious of, which theorists become really popular in the academy. And I always wonder if they become really popular because they speak to the academic's everyday life experience in some interesting way, right? So I think Deleuze and Guattari got very popular around the time that we were all getting our information through databases, and we found our references through databases. And so suddenly the rhizomes make sense to our everyday attempts to figure out what we should be reading, and kind of how we are connecting to people and things. So, and my PhD advisor loved Latour a little bit too much, which is why I began thinking about the ways in which his notion of networks without a finely tuned understanding of power made me, like, his fondness for Latour made me think, oh yeah, no, Latour is really there for the academic who doesn't like to think too much about their own relationship to power.
Ray, do you want to come in?
Yeah, or I think, is Ron Moore trying to get in there with a question?
I can't see the hands at the moment, so Ron, do shout.
Ilana, thank you very much. That's really interesting. And it's interesting because it opens up a number of possibilities to explore. The one area that strikes me to begin with is you take as a reference point the idea of, well, the contract for one thing, but also the power relations that Foucault and others talk about, certainly. And I like the way you juxtapose that with the kind of Marxist model as well. That was kind of nice to do that. I'm not sure how far you can go with that, and I'll tell you why. I think, as an old style sort of anthropologist, I like to go back to history, and I like to see the train of thought. So, for example, if you're tracing ideas from early capitalism, for example, so you're moving from a kind of a laissez-faire imagination to a more structured imagination, and then this idea of the contract. And I think you're onto something here. I actually think the contract is the essence of a lot of this. And in fact, had you not turned up today, we can't force you to turn up, but there was a contract, there was a moral contract there. And as you quite rightly pointed out, that, you know, you were breaking that moral contract, and there were possibly consequences for that as well. So I really think you're onto something with the power relations, certainly. But I do think there's scope for some sort of historical, or more scope for historical discussion leading into what you're talking about. But it's wonderful because it opens up numerous facets.
Well, thank you. No, I completely agree. I think that this is, and some of the other things I've tried to do to think about neoliberalism has been attempts to try to figure out ways to make it more historical. No one has been as thrilled as I have. We all have ideas that we think, wow, someone could really pick this up and do something with it, and like you don't find the right bar to walk into to convince them. But one of the ways in which I've been thinking about doing this historically is not actually about contracts, so I think contracts are very important, but like one of the ways to think about this distinction is to look at how new technologies get picked up, right? Because the ways in which new technologies get introduced and picked up under neoliberalism is very different than how it got picked up under Fordism, right? So that under Fordism, you kind of had schools and institutions and governments and kind of various institutions trying to control the ways in which people were managing the very odd things about new media, kind of any new technology that you have to deal with, right? The classic example is, if you introduce landlines, you have to figure out how to answer them, how to indicate that you are now on the other line. And people didn't know what word to use. So Edison wanted everyone to use hello, and Graham Bell wanted everyone to use ahoy, right? And Edison wins in part, I think, because his company was producing the phone books that then everybody was picking up, right? And you don't have this with Facebook, right? You don't have people kind of insisting, this is how we are going to define what poke means. Like, in kind of what neoliberal technologies are trying to do in order to get users committed is they're always giving them kind of glasses that are half full of meaning, and then the user is supposed to kind of contribute the rest of it. So I think there are a lot of interesting ways to kind of ask historically, how do these shifts take place in kind of a range of different facets to make that visible. But one of the things that I want to say about the hello versus ahoy, which is also actually very Foucaultian, like he talks about this in Discipline and Punish, which is, I don't know if you guys watch The Simpsons a lot, but Mr. Burns on The Simpsons will answer the phone, ahoy hoy. And it's in that moment that you see that, like, the ragged gestures of epic changes. Not everything changes all at once, right? And you have the traces of earlier attempts at standardization or control over labor emerging in various ways, right? You don't, kind of, not everything is neoliberal right now, right? Or fascist, whatever new era we're moving into.
Yeah, sorry, just very quickly to come back and then I'll go. I think you're right, but I think I mean, the other thing here is the definition of neoliberal, because one person's neoliberal, again, you point this out, is different to another person's. I suspect I don't more than suspect, I firmly believe this changes through history. The meaning of this changes through history, and as you point out in relation to technology and all the rest of it. And I wonder, again, getting back to Trump, I mean, and you're right. I mean, how can you describe Trump as a neoliberalist? I mean, he's more authoritarian and fits into a different model, frankly. So in a way, that was part of his problem in America of today, frankly. You know, he would have fitted in the former Soviet Union or any of those stands or wherever. He'd probably fit in better there. Kazakhstan is a good model. I think he would have done very well, something like that. Wouldn't have suited him. Yeah, but interesting.
I mean, he seems to still be doing very well. Like you say, that's part of his problem. I'm thinking that may be part of his appeal.
Ray, do you want to chip in?
No, thanks, Mel. And I really enjoyed reading the papers, and thanks for coming along. I just circle back to the contract, because I think that's what people wanting to. When you look at it kind of like as this, use that phrase, quixotic translations, do you feel like the contracts in some way capture a totality of social relations, and that it's the sedimentedness of the contracts that, you know, most of the contracts, employment contracts, exist in this long precedence of law and contestation, and encoded in them is all the historical fights that have gone on and everything that we've learned, or is it that they're just a backdrop to an authentic kind of moral economy of work where, you know, people don't read their contracts? And is that what's changing in the neoliberal contract with the kind of Uber and where the contract is the totality of the relations? Sorry, a muddled question, but
yeah, no. So I'm so glad you're asking me about the contract, because what I've been doing has been interviewing people about their employment contracts. Well, or rather, I should say that's what I began to do, right? So I began to try to do this, and I can tell you that my fieldwork was fairly difficult, not just because of the pandemic, but because people don't actually think about their contracts, and that their contracts are, for the most part, in their daily life, they don't deal with their employment contracts very much, right? So it is a tremendous amount of work and special circumstances that have to happen to make the contract vivid and important for people. At the same time, I think what's actually written as an employment contract is only part of what happens with what I'm thinking of as contractual sociality, right? Which is that people, let me back up. So I teach Durkheim fairly regularly. And one of the ways in which I teach Durkheim is by saying that he has this major problem in imagining the social contract and in trying to operationalize it, which is that there is never actually a moment where anybody signs the social contract, and he's a good enough ethnographer to worry about this, right? And the one space in which people are committing in some form or another to something that resembles a social contract is by joining a workplace in which they are trading away their autonomy for a certain form of security, right? And by having that in kind of contractual element to it, that idea is shaping their employment experiences and the strategies that they're doing at work. Right. So I have been interviewing a lot of people about their experiences working in person during the pandemic, and it's not going to surprise many of you that people are not exactly happy with the ways in which their employers are dealing with the potential risk of the pandemic at work. And so they're constantly struggling with the question of whether they should quit their job or not. And what's interesting for me in talking to them about it is they're not talking about collective action. Right? Some of them are, but the handful of people who are talking about collective action is much smaller than the number of people who are seeing their only appropriate political action in relationship to the contractual sociality, the contract, the kind of social contract that they feel being violated at work by the ways in which their employer is disregarding their life. Their response is to quit, right? And it's not that they're turning to their employment contract and saying, what is in my employment contract that will protect me, right? Now, so my take is that contracts matter tremendously as a set of assumptions shaping what people's political strategies at work are, but the actual contract doesn't always matter, or it takes a lot of work to make it matter. At the same time, I do want to say that contracts themselves have changed in response to neoliberalism, right? And so we now have many more non-compete clauses in people's contracts in the United States than ever before. And for people where you wouldn't think that a non-compete clause would make sense. So yoga instructors get non-compete clauses. My favorite non-compete clause that I have found was for a sandwich maker at a local chain sandwich shop that was told that he had to sign a contract where he not only could not work for another sandwich maker making or franchise for 6 months, but he couldn't work for the same chain for 6 months. He couldn't cross stores, and he was signing a contract to do that. So people are constantly forced to imagine themselves as businesses now in their contracts, in their employment contracts, in ways that they hadn't ever had to before.
Like, I wonder, as you were kind of explaining that, okay, so we don't daily consult our employment contract on our way to work to see what we have to do today. Do they have this kind of gentle performativity around the organization that it kind of seeps into the water, in that they produce kind of institutions and organizations? And I wonder, are there kind of middlemen, ticklers that negotiate those contracts? So in union type organizations, and that is your work taking you into that area at all?
Yeah, so that's fairly interesting. I didn't end up, I have heard anecdotally that places where union contracts are dominant, people talk a lot more about the contracts than they do. But I did not interview any, and this is pandemic fieldwork, so I'm not going into workplaces, much to my regret, and doing any hanging out. I'm reliant on whoever is willing to talk to me, because they saw my request on Facebook or from a friend, right? Reddit, by the way, did not work out very well for recruiting interviews. So unions are not, I did not come across instances in which unions contracts were something that people were thinking about or referring to very often. And the contracts that people were actually signing or engaging with, often ideas about them were very much in the workplace, but the ideas that they had were not necessarily legally enforceable. Right, so people had ideas of what the contract was supposed to say and do that wasn't actually what the contract said or did if you took it to a court of law. And the contracts were doing a certain amount of work, mainly around intellectual property issues. But for the most part, the contract that people were understanding, that of the people I was talking to, was more of a kind of moral sense of what kind of negotiation you have when you are working in terms of what your employer owes you and what you owe your employer. And that was doing a lot of work.
Okay. And is the escape hatch is the only response? You can only quit?
Well, the escape hatch was the political response for renegotiating. I say renegotiating, for saying no, for saying this is unacceptable, we need to change. Striking, for the most part, was not on any Americans' radar.
Yeah, and yet the bundle of skills and negotiation kind of thing is so strong in your work. But I want to bring in Tatsuma has his hand up for a while, if you'd like to.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, and I enjoyed reading your article on employing the CEO of me, and many reflections then, which triggered many reflections. And one is, actually I have two questions, is that okay? Sure. Yep, thank you. So the first one is, somehow this ethnography stays in kind of stark contrast to other anthropological works on Papua New Guinea or India, portraying the concept of person as an individual rather than individual in a contrasting way to how the individual is conceived in the West, and because from this ethnography, clearly the so-called neoliberal subject emerges as a bundle, as something more complex and subdivided in different segments, and perhaps as equally individual as in Papua Guinea, maybe in other terms. But so I was wondering whether this idea of individual may also be applied counterintuitively to this form of entrepreneurial self, which you have been describing. And actually, this reminds me of the work of Bruno Latour, whom you criticized a bit before. But I mean, Latour too, in contrast to works on ontological theory and anthropology, has tried to demonstrate how different ontologies may coexist in science, in the Western context. So somehow dismantling this dichotomy between West and rest, which is, I see this as sometimes reinforced in anthropology. And second question by some anthropologists, let's say. A second question is about whether you compared this particular construction of the self, of the neoliberal self in the US, with how neoliberalism has been translated, implemented in non-Western countries. I'm thinking about Japan, because I'm specialist of Japan, and there's a wonderful ethnography by Miyazaki Hirokazu. It's called Arbitrage in Japan. He did field work among in Japanese trade stock market among financial workers who were adopting to a certain extent this idea of a neoliberal self based on responsibility, or a strong individualism, tsuyoi kojinsei in Japanese. But on the other side, they were connecting this to new forms of spiritualism and New Age discourse in a very creative way. And I've seen in my work in Japan, in a similar way, how, for example, tourism and religion often combine together, also connecting these ideas of neoliberalist self with traditional forms of religiosity in shrines and temples.
So I love the fact that you asked me two questions which are which I experience as like profoundly contradictory in lovely, lovely ways, right? So I'm going to say that that no, I don't think of the neoliberal self as the divisible self or the partible self at all. And there are a couple of reasons why I don't think this. One is because I really do see the neoliberal self as a model that is not actually coming from people's actual practices, but that is being required to be constructed in response to particular large-scale socio-economic changes that are happening in the ways in which policy is transforming things, right? So this is a model that then gets to have to be translated, to speak to your second question, into different contexts, and how people pick it up is going to be culturally specific, right? So people have personal branding workshops in Kazakhstan, in Papua New Guinea, in Japan. But these workshops are being experienced in very different ways and have to be understood and mobilized into that context in different ways. But at the same time, I want to say that I'm turning to personal branding workshop to answer the first question of why is the divisible self different? One of the things that I found kind of perplexingly quaint in my fieldwork was how much people believed in authenticity. and that people believed that there was an authentic self that existed and created the kind of core, to speak to the contract questions that we've been kind of dealing with, you need to have a very stable, authentic self to be able to be properly in a contract, right? Which is one of the ways in which Trump is not functioning as a neoliberal self. And you need this in order to have security. You are constantly enhancing the self. You are constantly modifying them. What kind of security do you have that someone has been transformed outside of being useful in this business contract, other than the idea that you have an authentic self? And people, people dealt with authenticity almost as though it was magic, right? So when I talk to people about personal branding, the reason personal branding might not work is because the brand was not authentic enough. And that the important work was to figure out how to align the brand with one's authentic self. And I even interviewed someone who was going to therapy because they thought their therapist might help them uncover their authentic self and thus get their brand into proper shape, right? So I think this is not a concept of a person, of people as genuinely bundles of relationships, right? That's not what is going on. And there's a way in which the issues that happen when you genuinely think of yourself as a bundle of relationships in Papua New Guinea is very different. Like the social conundrums you have are very different than the social conundrums when you are an authentic self managing a bundle of relationships. Is that useful? Oh, wait.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Yeah,
oh, and I forgot. I wanted mentally to put in a plug for a new book on Japanese, in Japanese ethnography, so that you understand that, yes, I do read Japanese ethnography, which is Alison Alexie has a beautiful new book about divorce in Japan, in which she talks about how the kind of neoliberal ideas of autonomy and dependency are being introduced into people's understanding of intimate relationships, and people are deciding whether to divorce or not based on whether they have the right kind of code of dependency in their relationship. They don't want to be completely independent. The Japanese couples have retranslated this neoliberal vision into something else. They want the right kind of dependency.
Thank you.
I think, sorry, to hold it back, it's hard to, virtually simulate an actual coffee shop in this way. So we can tend to move from question to answer. I mean, and also, technology really matters, isn't it? Because you do a lot of research around LinkedIn, and that only allows you one profile, which speaks to that question of authenticity, the singular self, yeah, the developmental self, whereas every CB workshop says something like, tailor yourself, become a different self depending what you're applying for. So it's an interesting kind of contradiction. Yeah. But anyway, moving conversationally on, I think we have Kieran and then Anthony and then Jordan. So Kieran, do you want to?
Actually, Charles, Anthony had his hand up before I.
Sure. Go, Anthony. So.
Sure. Thanks. This has been great. As many of the people on the call will be aware, I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle. I'm more like the subject of the study rather than the student. In that I've worked for IBM for the last. I'm sorry.
Do you need chocolate?
Well, I've worked for IBM for the last 15 years, so I think I need something a little stronger than that. And I actually made the decision to leave IBM, and people don't know this, but I made the decision to leave IBM about 3 months ago. And in the last 2-3 months, I've been in the hiring process, and I'm hopefully coming to the end of that now this week. But it's been a strange kind of listening to you speak about it and thinking about me as the subject of all of this investigation. But two specific things that sort of popped as I was thinking about what you were saying. One was just in terms of the gig economy, and the ultimate neoliberal subject, this sort of slightly untethered thing, this resource that is consumed and disposed of fairly quickly by a corporation, asymmetries in power in being in that, but also a certain sort of bidirectional power, this new kind of power, this new kind of relationship to employment. I mean, the question is, what does this do to the contract status? How important is the contract? Or, you know, you talked about union versus non-union jobs having different sort of senses of the importance of the contract. It's a whole other thing, in, you know, for Deliveroo drivers or, you know, Uber drivers or that sort of thing. That was one question. Then the other question that I had was, you know, it's astonishing, not just the branding on LinkedIn and sort of social media and things like that, but how the hiring process itself is using technology now. And that you're instantiating, my academic work has been in sociology of technology over the last few years, and sort of you're deliberately encoding the hiring process into technologies and doing all this kind of filtering so that, you know, you can work through these technology. I wonder if you could just comment a little bit on how technology, particularly, it seems to have accelerated significantly in the last just 2, 3, 4 years, has changed the hiring process, or maybe even revealed some truths about the hiring process.
I mean, it sounds as you're asking me this, that you have some really interesting answers already.
Well, it's hard to distance myself from the process, to be honest. So I need a little bit of time, perhaps, to distill them down and write them up.
Right. So, I mean, so it's interesting that. So let me say, you're asking me things that I've written about, and so I'm trying to figure out how not to say too much. And it's very interesting that you're coming from IBM, because one of the things that that I've written and recently published about is with someone who was working at IBM doing research on what did it mean to bring online work distribution platforms into the firm. And so she was introducing the Uber or Amazon Mechanical Turk technology into the firm. And one of the things that's really interesting about how these online work distribution platforms operate is that the job roles aren't defining the tasks that people have anymore. It's the employer doesn't hire someone and then they do a certain number of things. The employee or the potential business partner chooses the task and then decides, and that task is a kind of fairly short and abrupt version, right? And the online work distribution platform imagines itself, it has this imagination in the ways it structures itself, that it is allowing businesses to contract with each other, and that it is a gateway for that to happen, right? And that's the ways in which these platforms have been resisting having to obey employment law practices in all sorts of different situations. One of the things that I'm really fascinated by in terms of how this works contractually is that when people are signing up, they're signing up using terms and conditions that they cannot negotiate in any way, sense, or form with the gateway platform. And then they're not actually negotiating with the people who they are choosing the work. The work is kind of, the work that they are offering is a set price that they are not setting, right? And so that's kind of some of the interesting things about the contracts. I had been hoping to do more research on what is contractual, kind of how do contracts play out for people in these platform situations. But then the pandemic happened, right? Like, I really wanted to know what happens when you don't have an HR to step in, when you're kind of like when you don't have any place to call, because Lyft and Uber and Airbnb are notorious at having really bad customer service for the people who they are pretending not to employ.
You know, if I, sorry, just to cut across you on that, it's really interesting that in IBM, over the last 5, 10, 15 years, you've kind of seen the same thing. I mean, you can't get to an IT help desk. You can't get to speak to somebody actually in HR about anything, you know, routine. It's all self-service. It's all, they're building all of these machines in. And so that's coming in, that part of it is coming in there too.
Yes. Yeah, no, that is really interesting. I'm gonna, if you want to know about the online experiments that were happening in IBM, that's the article with the online work distribution platforms.
Fantastic.
And so you had a second question about how the technologies were changing. Look, I studied hiring in 2013, 2014. And at the time, I came across a number of people in startups who had decided that LinkedIn was a terrible, terrible platform and that they were going to do it better. And so that I found fairly fascinating. Like, what was their imagination for how to do it better? And I have a chapter in my hiring book about how people they felt that LinkedIn wasn't neoliberal enough. And so they were coming up with strategies to make it better at being neoliberal. And so I kind of had a number of suggestions. One of the ones that I found strangest, and I'm really curious whether you came across it, is someone who's still a company, still very active, called NAC, in which they produced personality tests for people that people experienced as video games. So you play a video game, and that video game was supposed to reveal what your personal qualities were and whether you would be successful at a company or not. And companies that hired NAC for the hiring process would ask all their employees to play this video game, get personality profiles, and so you could see which personality profile would be successful in the company. And one of the things that the NAC CEO told me was that the same company in Brazil or in Italy had different kinds of personality profiles for success. And I thought, oh, some anthropologists would be very happy doing this research.
Yeah. I haven't come across them, but it doesn't surprise me. And, you know, around 2013, 2014, IBM bought a company called Connexa. And Connexa was an online human resources platform. And so it did everything from in terms of human resources. And I was very interested for a couple of different reasons into what they did. And I called them up, and it turned out that Connexa, it was $1 billion acquisition by IBM, but it wasn't actually one company. It was like, I don't know, 15 different companies that were all kind of rolled up into one by a whole bunch of venture capitalists and hedge fund managers and so on, and packaged up for sale to a company that wanted to get into the HR software as a service business. It just, there are so many different sort of strands with so many different bits and pieces. It was very disaggregated, and it was difficult to find a central theme in any of that.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's what's so interesting, is how much contracts now have to do the work of coordination.
I know that we're approaching 5 minutes towards the end. Maybe we'll be able to go over a little bit if we can trespass upon Ilana's time a little bit further. We have Kieran, Jordan, and then Damien lined up for questions. So Kieran.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks, Elena. Just very briefly, and is more contribution to your mail rather than anything else, but I'm thinking about the contract, going back to that in a moment, and it seems to me that the crucial issue between, let's say, good old ordinary old-fashioned capitalism and neoliberalism has something to do with the non-contractual element in the contract. In other words, the surplus, right? You can think of that, the sources would be maybe Zemel on the philosophy of money, or Mauss especially on the gift. Yeah. And the how of you know, that's in general economy, there's always something else. And Bataille in the accursed share, you know, that's something else. That surplus, that extra, is exactly what becomes, as it were, targeted for deep mining and further, let's say, work under the neoliberal revolution, where by what we see then as a sort of a monetization and a juridification of all of those previously non-contractual elements in the contract.
Right. So, I mean, I think what you're saying is speaking to something that I found kind of surprising in my fieldwork. So I began my fieldwork wanting to think about neoliberal employment contracts, right, and how neoliberalism creeps in. And I have, and what I found was, and this is just what it means to do fieldwork, that in talking to people about how their actual workplaces functioned, neoliberalism was not the logic. Like, they were not using neoliberal logics to understand how their fieldwork functioned, and it was the excess of the contract that they were dealing with instead. And it was, I mean, to understand my interviews, I am going back to Locke, Hobbes, Rousseau, and Durkheim. I cannot tell you, like, how dismaying it is to end up kind of having these are the thinkers who are explaining the particular conundrums that my people are dealing with. And then, of course, I think you're absolutely right, Simmel and Bataille kind of, and Mauss thinking through that in further versions.
Mauss will be crucial there, you know, because what people will say is, you know, that what's being stripped out of their lives, as it were, is their gift of, you know, duty or loyalty or all of those intangible things that now suddenly become, as it were, monetized and juridified. The sandwich maker, for instance, is your example. You know, I thought you were going to say, you know, that he was prohibited from making a sandwich for himself for lunch or something like that. That's the level at which this logic kind of deep mines and undermines, as it were, then the how of the, as in the Maussian how, you know, the gift, the surplus that's essential to any general economy. Yeah. But thank you. I'll say no more than enough said.
So before we hit 5 o'clock, Ilana, will you be able to stay on for another 10 minutes or something? Or sure, that's great. We're not rushed, and if anybody has to go, we appreciate that you have busy schedules and lives. I'll bring in Jordan now. He's had his hand up for some time.
Hey, how are we? I'm hoping I'm not kind of missing the point of anything here as well, or kind of going over something someone's already asked. But when I was reading through it, the two papers that were there, it kind of reminded me a lot when Tom, who's here now, actually taught me as an undergrad, a lot around the kind of business exchange in terms of the hiring process and the actual kind of job seeking process, and how you're essentially kind of getting into this kind of unequal kind of business kind of negotiation to kind of see what you can kind of get out of one another, and in terms of like flexibility and all these different skills that employers look for and all these other things. But I kind of wanted your thoughts more so. I don't know how much of a question is, but I suppose your thoughts on in the kind of hiring process and the picture that was on the screen there a few minutes ago in terms of, you know, part-time and temporary contracted employees not having much loyalty, that you're already kind of stepping into that negotiation as an unequal business partner in these kind of business relations as such. I just wanted your thoughts around kind of, in my own experience, the kind of worst jobs I've set up to interview for have given like tasks in interview and like 3 stages worth of interviews where one of the tasks or one of the processes is essentially party games, or being given A4 sheets and being told to sit with 3 or 4 people that are applying for the same job to build a rocket or some sort of structure, or all these types of things. And these were the ones kind of going back to Tom's teaching, that I always had it in my head that they're basically looking for you to kind of almost kind of sell yourself or embarrass yourself almost in order to kind of, you know, in these kind of really remedial tasks to get, you know, poor working conditions in a contract. I just wanted your kind of thoughts around that in terms of how this kind of emphasizes the power relations and this kind of unequal position between the person and the business itself or the employer.
Oh, so I wouldn't necessarily. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily think about being asked to build a rocket ship with 3 or 4 other people as an attempt at asserting a certain kind of power, because by now you've survived school for so long that you should have been well trained to be accepting unequal power relationships at work, right? what I think they're doing when they're doing that kind of task is people who are on the employment side have a tremendous problem, right? Which is all they have for kind of trying to figure out who is going to join their workplace is resumes, LinkedIn profiles, potentially they will, and job interviews in which people are actively performing, and it's a very weird and stilted conversation. And none of the skills that you have, that you exhibit in having in your resume or in your LinkedIn profile or in a job interview are likely to be the skills you are going to actually have to use at your job. So when you do something extremely well to get a job, it doesn't mean you're going to actually be extremely good at your job. And so they have this conundrum, and they're trying to figure out ways to see how are you actually going to interact with people on particular tasks and they're trying to come up, and they just don't have good ideas for doing this, and they will throw anything to try to break kind of around the very kind of the problem that the very standardized forms are deeply a problem for understanding what they really want to know, which is how good are you at getting along with people and how well will you do your job, right? So that's what they're trying to figure out in those moments. I think, but I think the interesting thing about employment contracts is that this is the one contract that it's very different from business to business contracts. This is the one contract in which once you sign it, someone else has the ability to direct, control, and surveil you in ways that you are not giving to anybody else, right? And that's what's so strange about employment contracts as a contract, is how much power is embedded in them. And one of the things that I find really strange, I've been attending salary negotiation workshops as the only place in which people are teaching other people how to negotiate this contract that is so powerfully loaded. People don't negotiate any of the power elements, right? They negotiate the salary, and in the salary workshops, they're not negotiating anything else. At most, they negotiate some time for themselves, but they don't negotiate IP issues. They don't negotiate non-compete clauses. The interesting thing for me is that independent contractors do, right? So people who really are imagining themselves as a business-to-business relationship, the independent contractors will do a lot more negotiation than the full-time employees will around a contract that hands over way too much power to someone else, as far as I'm concerned. There you see my bias.
Which connects nicely into the historicization we had with Elizabeth Anderson a few weeks ago and the almost feudal kind of power relations talking back here. But I want to hand over to Damien O'Doherty for, I think, the last question. Damien, welcome along.
Thanks, Tom. I just give a plug for that lovely book. You gave a plug to my old journal, Ephemera, so I thought I'd return the compliments. But I did want to say that the book has been fantastic, and it's been really productive for me in terms of teaching ethnography, actually. The first chapter is written, or the first two chapters, written so clearly and in the best traditions of descriptive ethnography that so many students have been turned on to ethnography in the past year as a result of teaching this. So thank you for that, Ilana. It does connect with undergraduates and postgraduates as well. It's a very good book, but I have a couple of questions, and I'm terrific to have the opportunity to pose them to you. One is going back to which I'm not sure. I think there's more to be thought about, and that is the conditions for the production of knowledge today. Tom mentioned that fairly quickly after your presentation, but I wonder if that's worth another go at, because you perhaps there's a danger of making an object of neoliberalism, and of course with that ism comes a whole set of kind of worries, I think, about reification or objectification. So maybe that reflecting back on the conditions for the production of knowledge about this thing you called neoliberalism is worth another go. And the second question, which is related to that, I think, is what capacity there is for exploring the contradictions of this. You started to touch on that, actually, just the last few questions, the contradictions of what you're calling the neoliberal logic. the excesses which are produced in excess of the managerial or contractual capacity to control and contain. So the unanticipated consequences of some of this. So in economic sociology, Oliver Williamson's work, of course, has long argued about the failings of contract models of information asymmetries, and I think guile and otherwise. So I mean, I wonder with the ethnography you've done, whether there is something over and above that which you could point to in terms of the contradictions and excesses which cannot get folded back or contained into managerialized employment relations.
So I'm wondering, when you ask me about the conditions of knowledge, I immediately start thinking about Phil Moravsky's work and his cadre of historical kind of, he's kind of a historian of economics in thinking about how and there's also some new very interesting work about kind of the Rand Corporation and its version of managerial capitalism and how that may have been more important than University of Chicago Economics Department and George Mason's think tanks and all the think tanks that ended up spreading this particular logic. Are you thinking about something else? Like that, when you say conditions of knowledge for this, I immediately think, here is a theory that particular people developed and we need to know how it spread, right? And then how it continues to spread. So like one of the things that I didn't talk about yet that I find mesmerizing is that the LinkedIn as a company has created this technological, this profile that has deeply embedded with it neoliberal assumptions about how to be in business. And then what has happened is that nonprofit organizations all over the United States have developed LinkedIn workshops that the LinkedIn company itself doesn't know to promote LinkedIn and to teach you how to use LinkedIn. So there's, and these nonprofit organizations are often government funded, so that there's an enormous work going on through career counseling mechanisms, through all the kind of infrastructure around career counseling to promote this very particular technology that it in and of itself promotes a very neoliberal perspective, from my take, a very neoliberal perspective of things. So like, so I'm wondering, when you say conditions of knowledge, I'm kind of wondering what you mean.
Yeah, that's partly that. I mean, Foucault would of course look to material and institutional conditions for the production of knowledge historically, if you like.
Yeah.
And the things that you've identified there, I think, would come to your attention if you're thinking with Foucault on those things. But what happens is, if you follow the practices, what happens is you get a discipline and punish reading of that, which is a genealogy, which at each point of, if you like, episodic encounter, the ethnographer's episodic encounter, would find contradiction and tension, as opposed an immanence, if you like, as opposed to the kind of leap then into the transcendence, which is the carapace which you put round this as neoliberalism. Do you see what I mean in terms of that?
I mean, but just because you have the neoliberal logic doesn't mean you have it accepted.
But is it logical or coherent? Is that logic imply a coherence though?
No, not at all. I mean, that's precisely what I'm trying to track, is what are the moments in which in which people use parts of the logic against itself.
Okay, great.
Right. The fact, what I'm really interested in is, I'm assuming that neoliberalism, when it hits the ground, doesn't hit the ground smoothly, and that, and it's not only that there is kind of translation work that's happening in that moment, but that people will use parts of the logic to argue against other parts of it, because when it begins implemented, like when you start to kind of think like a neoliberal, you are still jockeying for power and particular and resources, and so you may be kind of focusing on one part of the neoliberalism as opposed to the other. Now, in saying this, there's also room for kind of outside critique. Like, people are not only neoliberal, hopefully. Like if they are, then having to deal with them does require a lot more than chocolate. But this is, but there are moments in which you are in a very neoliberal context where other arguments are not going to work, right? Where you really are stuck in a very particular episteme where there aren't other options that you can pull in. And in those moments, people are using aspects of the neoliberal logic to argue against other aspects of the neoliberal logic. And I think that that hasn't been tracked enough. Like, people haven't explored that enough. Academics are just so horrified by neoliberalism that they attack its precepts from the outside. And I think we need to kind of see the fractures from the inside.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, agreed. Very nice. Thank you.
Yeah, real existing living neoliberalism here in the former project, but not quite the same thing. Listen, I just want to, on behalf of everyone, thanks very much to Ilana for giving us a very interesting discussion. And, you know, I think that a conversation about the life, the universe, and everything for an hour is a lot more challenging than a paper. So thanks very much for rolling with all these questions so thoughtfully. Next week, next Tuesday, myself and Ray are talking about our new book. So if you're gonna be free at 10 o'clock, love to see you all again. And so it just remains to me to say thank you very much, everybody, and see you again soon.
And thank you for all these wonderful questions. These were extremely helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.